All right, and we are live. Welcome to Underground Catholicism. I am your host, Elijah Yassi, and I have the pleasure of introducing a new guest today. This is his first time on this show, and actually his first time on a show. Excited to hear what James Doeffinger has to say. I was botching his name before the show. I was saying Doeffinger, but he corrected me. So Doeffinger, James Doeffinger. How are you today, James?
I'm doing good, Elijah. And yeah, you're fine on the name pronunciation. I've heard it worse ways.
Yeah, no, my I have a Middle Eastern name. My real name is not Elijah. My real name is Ehab, and I go by Elijah. And
Oh,
I've
okay.
heard people botch it left and right. So, but in any case, today we are talking about the papacy. As you guys know, that's the topic that I usually have on the show. It's not exclusive to this topic, but just lately I've been talking about this, and James and I have been wanting to do this show for what has that been, like 6 weeks now or so, maybe even more.
Yeah,
Um, and then we keep postponing it for whatever reason.
our schedules
Finally,
hate each other.
exactly, yeah. But I just wanted to open the mic up here, and if you can introduce yourself, and introduce who you are, where you come from, your background, and your conversion story.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So my name is James Doeffinger, as Elijah said. I am a convert to the Catholic Church. I was received into full communion back in 2018 at the Easter Vigil at St. Mary, Mother of the Church, Roman Catholic Parish in Garner, North Carolina. That's where I'm from, is Raleigh, North Carolina, but Garner is just like 15 minutes from Raleigh. It's a very small town. You could drive through it in like 10 minutes. So yeah, it's just like a strip mall and like an AutoZone and a few places, and that's it. And it's like, and then you're done, and then you're on the highway. um, but yeah, so I, in terms of my background, I was raised essentially Southern Baptist, dispensationalist, evangelical type. I was homeschooled. My parents, all the churches we went to were basically affiliated with the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, in some capacity. So even some we went to that didn't use the title of Baptist, they were still like they would give like discounts to the local seminary, Southeastern Baptist in Wake Forest, North Carolina, where I attended the college there for a few years. And then I started looking more into patristic stuff, and I was like, oh, well. And I knew that I had to take some time off to look into that more. And that was around 2017. Fall of 2017 was my last semester there. And then well, even before that, because like that fall semester, a lot happened because I was in RCIA. I wasn't sure I was going to go through with conversion, but around March of 2018, I was pretty confident about my decision, and then decided to go through with conversion. And but one thing that's kind of funny is that even though I was raised dispensational and so forth, through my own studies, I became Reformed and Calvinistic, and very covenantal, which is, exact opposite of dispensationalism. And so I like to say I chose, through my free will choice, I chose Calvinism for a time. But I yeah, I was really influenced by people like James White and R.C. Sproul. I watched almost everything James White put out in terms of Catholicism. Watched all of his debates. He had this old series from the 90s, which I know he always talks about, which I know Michael often his reviews always gets annoyed by this, and I do too, because it's like the glory days of James White, or the 90s. But but yeah, they were called the Great Debates, and he had a lot of them on like Long Island, New York, and stuff, which is neat because my family, my mom's side of the family, is from that area. So, but so listening to him, he was like essentially my Calvinist pope, for lack of a better term, and I was an ardent follower. R.C. Sproul was influential to a degree. Like I read His Holiness of God and What is Reformed Theology. That was really influential on me in being reformed and so forth. And justification by faith alone was really big. I struggled with certain Reformed doctrines at first, like such as limited atonement, where Jesus only dies for the elect that are predestined. And there's a predestined for hell, essentially, if you take a more stronger view of double predestination, essentially. This is oversimplifying, but yeah. But that was a doctrine I struggled with for a while, because I looked into like 4-point Calvinism, where they hold to a universal atonement and so forth. And so, but eventually, by listening more to James White, it became more harder in my Calvinism, and I kind of went through what they call the cage stage Calvinists, where I was like debating a lot of people angrily on online forums and stuff, and then some of my friends trying to convert them to Calvinism. And as an effect of that, not just with Calvinism, but specifically with justification by faith alone, I started to view Catholics, and then later on, by extension, Orthodox, as, holding to like a false gospel and earning their salvation and so forth. And I would kind of have a kind of tongue-in-cheek double talk, I guess you could say, where I would basically realize that Rome's theology, as I would say, I use terms like classical reform terms like Romanist or Papist and stuff like that, which now are kind of terms of endearment to me now. But I in looking through all that in justification, I was basically like, I can't really hold Catholics as like brothers and sisters and so forth in Christ, which looking back at is kind of, I disagree now, of course, but one of the double things is kind of interesting, is that even as I've studied Catholicism on the one hand and became Catholic, simultaneously I learned about really better Protestant positions that were out there too, because the struggle to become Catholic was really real. And what we're going to talk about tonight, especially with papal infallibility, I did not, like that whatsoever. I viewed the Pope as a tyrant, and strangely enough, I never fell for the Antichrist thing. That always kind of made me cringe. I always didn't really find that to be a good argument. I mean, I did believe that it was I believed it was false, that the papacy was not really divinely instituted. I saw it more as this sort of accidental thing of history with a lot of development and contradiction and so forth. And so, yeah, so James White essentially made me, become Calvinist for a time. And then it was my Calvinism started to crack around. And to be fair, too, like even before looking at Calvinism, I was looking at Catholicism prior. So it was really, he's deleted his videos now, but this guy named Keith Thompson, he had a lot of stuff up back in the day, like in 2013, 2012, about, he had like an 8-hour documentary on Catholicism. And on other channels on YouTube, you can find it sort of reincorporated into other channels and refashioned. But I don't know what's going, because he went to grad school for theology, and I don't know if he changed his views or not, but a lot of stuff he's taken down. So I don't know if that's indicative of him changing his mind or not. I have no idea. I actually had some email correspondence with him, thanking him for some of his material, because prior to watching his stuff, I was really open to Catholicism. I was open to Catholicism and Orthodoxy too, actually. So, but then, from around 2013 to 2017, half of 2017, I had a very hard Calvinist phase. Then, and there were doubts sometimes, or questions and so forth that would pop up, but I would either talk to my pastor or I would call into James White's show and try to deal with them from a Reformed perspective and so forth. And then I had a few friends who had either converted to Catholicism, or who were looking into Catholicism, or who had converted to Orthodoxy. And so that made me kind of nervous because I didn't really know what to do with that fully, other than try to go back to the Reformed line. And especially when because I had an Orthodox friend who, unfortunately, now he's in the genuine Orthodox groups, which is kind of unfortunate. For those of you who don't know, that's like the Orthodox Sedevacantists. But back then, though, he was reading stuff from like Michael Kruger and stuff on the canon and wasn't finding it really convincing. And that made me nervous because like Kruger was like the answer that James White said was like, going to stop you from converting to Catholicism. And it wasn't as this, titanic thing that was presented to me. And just a lot of, and in between that too, I'm actually, I'm paraphrasing a lot because am writing out my conversion story. So I would either going to do a podcast of my own on that or a blog series. But one final thing I'll say is that, there was definitely a lot of prayer and study involved. And then in 2017, that was a big year for me because it's funny because that's the 500th year anniversary of the Reformation. And one of my good friends at the time and today too, Matt, he said, James, don't tell me God doesn't have a sense of humor when my most Calvinistic friend is going to RCIA in the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And so one of the things that caused me to go into RCIA, though, is because, entering that year, I was fully Calvinist, but it was an ecclesiology class I took at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. I was under Dr. Keithley, who's a Southern Baptist theologian. He's written a lot on Molinism and philosophy and creation and ethics and stuff like that. So in the Southern Baptist world, he's pretty well known. And if you study Molinism too, he's a contemporary in that debate as well. So a lot of respect for him in all those other areas. But when we came to ecclesiology, I was really kind of disheartened because he talked about the Southern Baptist Convention. And he said that the Southern Baptist Convention only exists one time a year when it's convened in a convention. When it is not convened in a convention, it's really just sort of a combination of corporate church, parachurch ministries working together to do gospel work and stuff. And that really, I was like, because at this time I had Presbyterian leanings, and I was just like, wait a second, what? Because I thought it was like some other Reformed denominations that are Baptist, which are still more of a denomination, like I believe it's called ARPCA or something like that for the 1689 Reformed Baptists. And that was the other thing too. I went back and forth between Reformed Baptist and Presbyterian and Anglican. And but then I'm like, well, Anglican sounds too papist. But Anglicanism did make me, I didn't do it as extensively as some other like Anglican converts did, but it made me look at the episcopacy in the early church. And that's when a lot of stuff started to turn mentally. And then I started reading selections from Eusebius's Church History and other stuff. And I started to listen to church historians that were Catholic. So I listened to Jim Papandrea was really big. Dustin Quick recently had him on his channel talking about church history. And so, I watched his whole church history series, and I didn't really know what to do with it. It was kind of like a massive paradigm shift and existential crisis, and it was difficult. And so in the summer of 2017, I had another theology class, which my professor, Dr. John Hammett, one of the things we were talking about Christology, and we were supposed to, for that class give him a whole bunch of questions. And one of the questions I asked was, is there any relationship between Christology and Mariology? Because it seems like if you have Christology, and I'm a Calvinist, like I haven't read anything on Mariology at the time, but I was just like, well, if what you say is true about Christ, don't you have to say what's true about Mary in some sense? It doesn't have to be the Marian dogmas, but in some sense. And I was specifically asking about the Immaculate Conception. And Dr. Hammett gave the reply basically saying that not only is it not necessary to believe in like the Immaculate Conception, but he said it's more accurate to talk about Christ's Immaculate Conception, or Christ's and then he made this distinction too, where not a virgin birth, but a virgin conception. And so I was like, that's interesting. And that mainly had to do with his view of like the fall and the birth effects of birth pains of Mary and giving Christ and so forth, and his him not liking more traditional Catholic views on that and so forth. And so that kind of I was like, all right, so that's kind of odd. But the one big thing that stood out to me from that class that he said was because we were reading quotes from the church fathers and councils and stuff, and a lot of this was really was familiar and new to me because I had done reading prior. But he basically said, especially when we were talking about the episcopacy and stuff, he said, well, essentially you have to what you have to realize is that at the end of the day, the Bible trumps scripture, trumps tradition or man-made tradition, but even all tradition too. And so that I was like, I found that really unconvincing, because at the time I held to the Reformed theologian Keith Matheson's view of solo versus sola scriptura, where the Reformed have a view of scripture and tradition, even though it's tradition is subordinate to scripture. There's still a care and concern about history and the past. And even though I'm, critical of Matheson, and I recently read his book during COVID on that in more detail. I read an article at the time. I actually had him, and that's the other thing too. I took a semester. I was thinking of going to Reformation Bible College. I actually went there for one semester in 2016, and I had Dr. Matheson as one of my professors, and so he taught his view of sola scriptura and stuff. And then also I eventually withdrew from the class, but I had a few classes with R.C. Sproul Jr. And so forth. So a lot of these Reformed guys in the Florida area. But anyway, moving back to 2017. So that, and then I watched the Marian Dogmas debate which was like 3 hours long, between James White and Peter Williams, who's a British Catholic apologist and ethicist and so forth. Mainly does stuff more on like marriage and life issues. But that was really hard because he drew from so many ancient sources. It was really hard for me to know what to do with that at the time, because I mean, Williams' presentation, I recommend everyone watch that debate. Williams' presentation, he said, yes, he's going to defend the Catholic views, but he also drew from Orthodox sources and like Assyrian Church of the East and Oriental Orthodox, everyone and so like what were the vanilla teachings on, as it were, on Mary. And he basically argued for the perpetual virginity, the sinlessness and so forth. And he did eventually argue for the Immaculate Conception later on and so forth. But that was, and then also they debated on sola scriptura, and so that was really it wasn't quite, it was almost, I want to say it was almost devastating, because it wasn't like, okay, I'm going to join the church right away, but like it gave me serious doubts where I'm like, I can't just put this on the back burner. I've really got to look into this. And so the big thing for me that both Protestants and Catholic apologists emphasized over the years was, because I've been listening to Catholic Answers, since like 2013. So even before I was Calvinist. So I was familiar with a lot of the arguments. I was a big auditorial learner during this time. I did read, but my reading was very different than it is now. My reading back then was more philosophical and stuff about like creation and evolution and stuff like that. So and then like existence of God and things like that, and then just books on Reformed theology. But I knew from what Catholics and Protestants were saying in debates that the issue of authority is really what kind of undergirds everything. And so I was like, well, I guess I should look into the issue of, tradition and the papacy. And, several big books later, I became a Catholic, and I was like, and kind of begrudgingly too, because like I didn't want to be. I was like, well, dang it. But over time, I developed different things like a deep devotion, and I know this sounds cheesy, but like a deep devotion to Our Lady, and which is I never expected, especially as a Calvinist. I was like, what? Everything. My first prayer. There's a garden outside of St. Mary's Parish in North Carolina, where I was received, and there's a statue of Our Lady. And I remember in the fall of 2017 going up to the statue and just being like, I don't know if this is idolatry or like apostasy or if like I'm going to hell. And I didn't know how to pray the rosary yet, clearly. But I was like, so I just want to talk to you for like an hour, see how this goes, and hope I'm not struck by lightning, basically. And so had that, and I remember ending the prayer with, I'm told that, the purpose of your intercession is to lead you closer to your son. So please do that. And ever since then, she's played a very important role in my spiritual devotion and so forth. And it's cool and interesting too, when we talk about the papacy, how it intersects and interacts with other doctrines and dogmas, such as the Immaculate Conception, which I know that you were really excellent on, as is William Albrecht and Father Capps and stuff. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. If you have any, I guess, questions or follow up and so forth, go from there.
Sure. No, I appreciate that, James. I'm sure everyone was really tuned into that. I like how you took us through your process, and now you're Catholic. And as a Catholic, you've read, you probably lost count of how many books on the papacy, probably like 25 or 30 or something like that. And that's not even an exaggeration, I don't think. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's well, Goodreads. That's what Goodreads is for. It helps me keep track of my reading. I've read about I'm gonna say 35 or 36. I have my papacy section over here. My room's a mess, so I won't show it, but I'm looking at them right here. But yeah, so and a lot of one thing that was really helpful too is I developed a good a good nerdy Facebook friendship with Eric Ibarra back in 2018, right before I was about to be received at the Easter Vigil. I was reading the French Orthodox theologian Oliver Clement's work, You Are Peter, an Orthodox theologian's perspective in response to St. John Paul II's Ut Unum Sint, which invited Easterners to respond to that. And so I was reading it and I was like, wow, this is interesting and different. And there was some things in there I didn't really know how to address and I was like unfamiliar with. And so I posted in like, I also joined like a crap ton of like Catholic Facebook groups. There's like Catholic, I think the one I was in at the time was not St. Peter's. St. Peter's Pub is another one, but there was I think it was called just Catholic Answers or something like that. But anyway, I posted into that group and Eric was a part of that group. And so he commented and he sent me an article of his by Pope St. Gregory the Great and some other stuff of his on St. Cyprian. And I noticed that at first I thought the guy who sent it was some other guy. I didn't realize that the blog and him were the same. So, because I had heard of the blog like peripherally, like in like the algorithms on Facebook and Google suggested it to me. And so it was funny because I was chatting him. I was like, wait a second, you wrote this? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, oh. So then I was like, I have so many questions. And then from then on, we just talked a lot and had several conversations, more so in 2018 2018 and 2019. COVID, of course, everyone was on their own, doing their own thing and stuff. And I actually just had a phone call with him yesterday. It was pretty cool catching up. But yeah, he was really influential because I asked him, I was like, hey, I want to be honest about this. I don't just want to read books that confirm the Catholic view. And to be honest, I wasn't really even there yet. Like I wasn't at the point of like, yes, let's be Catholic. Like that took a little bit. But I said at the outset, I want to read both pro and con. So whatever critical books you have on the papacy to read, I will read them. Please, send them to me and like links and stuff. Not like buy them for me, but so I read pretty much everything he's recommended, and even after reading, because initially I took the spring of 2018 off to like delve really deeply into all this stuff, and so when my semester ended at Southeastern in December of 2017, I went into reading John Chapman, his works on the early papacy. Then I read, as I said, Oliver Clement, and then Meyendorff's Primacy of Peter. And then I read Steve Ray. And then I read, I think, as Herbert, this is really what kind of did it for me. And there was more stuff I learned after this too. But as Herbert Scott's old dissertations from like the 1920s, it's been reprinted. I forget who did it. But actually, hey, hang on a second. Yeah, so this book, The Eastern Churches and the Papacy, that really kind of hit the nail for me. I was like, wow, I can't, because what it helped do was what a lot of works I was reading before didn't fully do was I was convinced of apostolic succession. I was like, okay, I see that. And I see these lists of popes in Rome and so forth. And, reading stuff from Sungenis and other Catholic Answers articles. I'm like, okay, I see apostolic succession and primacy, but show me where in the church that you had bishops of Rome saying that they held this by divine right and had jurisdiction over other churches. And that's essentially what S. Herbert Scott's whole thesis is about, is showing how the papacy and the Eastern churches functioned in the first 800 years or so, not quite for the first millennium. He does it before the Phocian incident, mainly because in his perspective, he was responding to different scholars that pretty much said the papacy was created by, as we know it today, by St. Pope Nicholas I in his correspondence with the Patriarch Photius of Constantinople. And so now his stuff on that is kind of outdated. At least Dvornik is considered the expert and the standard in scholarship today. So a little bit outdated, but he still makes some good points. And he does a lot of his own translation from Minge and Patrologia, I think it's called, Latina, and a lot of the Latin sources. One thing that made me mad was he was like, oh yeah, there's all this stuff of St. Pope Nicholas I that's never been translated into English. And I was like, what? Why? I feel betrayed. and so I was like, somebody call Ryan Grant. We need him on this immediately. And so, because I had read Ryan Grant's Bellarmine translation. And so I'm just like, I want all the Pope Nicholas. I want it all. So, but yeah, so essentially that dissertation, I was like, okay, I'm done. Like, I can't. Like, I knew that there was more stuff and more learning to do, and I still wanted to, even though going into the Catholic Church, I still wanted to be fair to the Orthodox and Anglicans and other communions, and so I still decided to read their stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, after that, I read a lot of stuff Eric recommended, such as Stachensky, his book. Papadakis, who was a Greek Orthodox. I don't know if he's alive or not today. He might be dead. I can't remember, but he did a lot of stuff with St. Vladimir's seminary, and he does. He wrote his book on the Christian East and the rise of the Papacy. And so he basically, his thesis is similar to the thesis that as Herbert Scott was responding to, in that the papacy was, as we know it today, in Vatican I, was essentially created by the Gregorian reforms. And so Papadakis, and Meyendorff does that too, as well, basically says the Gregorian reforms is pretty much where we see the rupture between East and West. So yeah, and so ever since then, it's been history and watching a lot of, watching a crap ton of videos on it as well. I'm at 230 something. It might be a little bit more because there's stuff from non-YouTube as well. But yeah, so that's been fun, and I have more to go. Definitely, I'm actually literally looking at a stack here of more stuff to read on the issue. So it never ends.
Absolutely, yeah. This study never ends. You're absolutely right. But I appreciate that, and that's good. I mean, I didn't know a lot. I didn't know a lot about this. I mean, we talk on Facebook here and there, but nothing extensively about your background. So this is really interesting. I used to be a Calvinist myself, kind
Okay.
of like unofficially. I mean, I don't know if you want to call it. I mean, I believed in all the stuff that the Calvinists believed, but I was only a Christian for like a year or so believing in that, and then
Mm.
I was born Catholic, and then I went back to my Catholic faith after I discovered the Church Fathers. But I believe the double predestination and all that stuff. But I didn't read like extensively like you've read on this topic. And then here we are with the papacy. We are. Let's get into that. Let's talk about the papacy.
Sure. Yeah.
You read the Relatio. You watched some of my stuff, and you said you read the Relatio and you wanted to see for yourself what it says. Give us your thoughts, your impressions, your opinions on it, your commentary. What did you think of the Relatio when you read it?
So I was surprised in a few different ways.
And by the way, James, let me just, for the folks who don't know what the Relatio is.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
so the Relatio of Bishop Gasser is a document from Vatican I. If you want to read it, it's from that book right there that he's holding up, The Gift of Infallibility. You could read it. It's the official interpretation of Vatican I, of Pastor Returnus, chapter 3 of Vatican I, of what papal infallibility and papal supremacy is. It's what the document. It's a document that the bishops of Vatican I read in order to vote on the dogmas of papal infallibility and papal primacy or supremacy, however you want to say it. So it's a very important document, and it is known as the official interpretation of Vatican I. If you haven't read it, you can get that book. You can get on Google Books. I think it's also on Kindle, and you can also buy the physical copy. I recommend reading it. And that's what we're going to be discussing, and a little bit of papacy and Vatican I and things of that sort. But go ahead, James. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh no, you're fine. That's a great introduction. So my thoughts were mixed in that, and positively, because it's funny because I had it added on my wish list for Amazon for quite a while, and I thought for some reason, I think I got it confused with some other book because I thought it was far more long than it is. As you can tell, I mean, this is only like 100 and some odd pages. So I thought it was enormous. I thought it was going to be like Denzinger or something like that.
Yeah, and that's not even all. Some of that is a commentary from Father O'Connor, who wrote
Right.
the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's even shorter than 100 pages. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. But I was really impressed at how clear it was, how concise it was. So that mainly because of the misunderstanding that it was another book. So that was a big one. But also how short it was in terms of like, because it's like going back to the table of contents. It's actually like almost like 80 some odd pages, and then the rest is his Father O'Connor's commentary. But one thing that came to mind that was important in reading this text was, I'm bringing it up here. I thought it was interesting because right from the get-go, Gasser, sorry, I'm trying to find it here. Yeah, so right from on page 13, so the first draft of chapter 4 on papal infallibility, that's chapter 4 of Pastor Turner's, of course, since it's on Vatican I. And he says, and because it is not possible to set aside the words of our Lord Jesus Christ when he says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, we see that these words are proved true by events because the Catholic faith has always been preserved immaculate in the Apostolic See, and its doctrine kept holy. Christ's faithful are held to follow this Apostolic See in all things, so that they may deserve to be in one communion with that same See in which there is present the whole and true security of the Christian religion. And then he goes on to quote stuff from Lyons and so forth. But one of the things that was interesting about Gasser is there is, and I can understand for people that are skeptical of the papacy, that high language is what's really noticeable. It's very strong. I mean, the Immaculate Faith, for example, is something that sticks out. But it's interesting that he says in all things, and I haven't read Eric's article yet, but I've myself been thinking similar things to that, where Eric wrote an article about basically rad trads and the Relatio. And in reading this, it basically kind of has made me think about various dissenters in the church and the lack of nuance that there often is on both sides, not just liberals, but also conservatives or those who want to reject Vatican II and the magisterium. And so Gasser basically is like, you can't do that. Like, you can't, if you're going to be Catholic, you literally can't do that. And he does make some good qualifiers too, especially if a Protestant is reading this. On page 87, he talks about how it is expressly stated that the impeccability of the Pope is not included in the definition on infallibility. And that's really important because he goes through several moral characteristics too related to the doctrine. And that's something that Catholic theology, I think, has done very well since Vatican I, about separating the office from the person to a certain extent, and then also a union of those two in other ways as well. But like a separation in terms of that the office is what is protected and preserved throughout history in perpetuity, as Vatican I says, the succession of bishops of the Roman See and so forth, and that it's not conditional upon the moral failings or shortcomings of those holders of the office. And from history we know this. If you just look at it's often brought up, well, what about the popes of the Borgia popes, the Renaissance popes, or the Medicis, and or the Pronocracy back in the 900s, the 10th century. It's actually interesting about, just a quick thing about the Pronocracy, where literally there's an orgies going on in the Vatican. Sachensky in his book talks about different quotations where this news reached other people in the East and other bishops. And one of their responses was basically, well, it's a good thing this is a divine office and not contingent upon the human person holding to it. That's me paraphrasing and simplifying it. I actually need to track that down, but I remember highlighting it when I read it. It always stuck out to me. And so, and also just the church, that Gasser's emphasis is on the Pope as teacher, that Peter speaks. It's not just something we read in church history at the Council of Chalcedon where the bishops say Peter has spoken through St. Leo, but it's something that continues to this day. And that tradition is not this dead thing, but it's alive. And it's kind of like a saying that Pope Francis has, that tradition is not this museum of the past, but it's something that's living. It's like it's a tree, and kind of uses some languages from St. John Henry Newman as well, where it's a tradition is like this tree, especially with doctrinal development from like the seed to the tree and all that. But and then another thing too, trying to see here. One thing I like about O'Connor himself is that he juxtaposes very well and very succinctly the theology of Vatican I to the theology of Vatican II, and he gives some citations from St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and so forth. I think when at the time this was published, Benedict was still Pope, so he quotes from some of their stuff on the papacy. He quotes from that famous Wednesday audience that St. John Paul II had about the Holy Spirit assisting the Roman pontiff. And that's another thing, too, within Gasser as well, is that there's this pneumatological component of ecclesiology where the Holy Spirit guards and protects the office from, at the level of ex cathedra, from defining something that's heretical or wrong, and also at the level of or the ordinary magisterium in terms of assisting the Pope. Not that he's inspired, and Gasser is really, and O'Connor are very keen in making the distinction between infallibility and inspiration and so forth. That the Pope is not like an apostle writing scripture or something like that. It's not the same type of literature at all, even though it's still authoritative, but it's still a different type. So, objectively within the Catholic magisterium, scripture is in a different category ontologically than papal documents are, even though papal documents are part of the ordinary and extraordinary, depending on what they say, magisterium. So I always found that really interesting and a really important emphasis. And O'Connor is also helpful too. Like on 123, he goes through infallible levels. This is something I know this is more, this is definitely Michael Lofton's expertise, but he goes through the ordinary magisterium, the Pope and bishops teaching well dispersed throughout the whole world, and bishops teaching in harmony a truth that they say must be held definitively by all the faithful. That's what's infallible. And the non-infallible is all other instances of teaching on faith or morals and so forth. And a lot more could be said there. But I do like how he breaks that down very simple, in very simple terms. So there's so much going on within Gasser. And I also like too, it's kind of funny how he goes through sort of some of the voting process as well, like this article was rejected, that we found it like not adequate or not sufficient and so forth. So it's cool to see the human element of this as well, not just like, because it's not like, Gasser fell down from heaven or something like that. It was a very real human process that took place, and with different infighting and debates and so forth. I mean, as you know, and as many who have read this period of history know, that it caused Vatican I had there was a schism of the old Catholics that left, that didn't agree, the minority group that didn't agree with the ex cathedra and so forth. One thing I didn't know actually until recently was the leader of the group of the old Catholics, Ignaz von Doeffinger. He wrote a book basically called The Pope and the Council, and then Hergenrother, a German canonist and historian, replied to his work refuting it. And one of the things that Chapman talks about in his very short book, The Papacy and or Papal Infallibility and the Seven Ecumenical Councils, or something like that, he actually talks about how later on Doeffinger changed his mind and actually recanted that, his views that were critical, and basically said that he misunderstood the doctrine, which is kind of a big deal, but yeah. So,
Yeah, and then if you actually look at this quote that Gasser quotes, he's quoting from another bishop, and to your point, he says, he's talking about the Roman See. He says, if this Roman See could fall and be no longer the see of truth, but of
mhm,
error and pestilence, then the Catholic Church herself would not have the bond of society and would be schismatic and scattered, which is in fact impossible. And this is an interesting quote because Vatican I is talking about when the Pope is infallible, right? Like
mhm,
when should we trust him? Basically, when he's speaking ex cathedra, and so a refutation of that is like, okay, well, yes, it can't be the see of pestilence and error. Um, it's impossible for that to happen. But that's only true when he's speaking ex cathedra, right? And that's very limited. But if you read another section, he actually says that ex cathedra's, he says there have been thousands upon thousands that have come out from the popes. So he's not this minimalist when it comes to ex cathedra's. He's not like, okay, yeah, there's only been two, or at his time would be one, the Immaculate Conception.
mhm.
There are some who believe it's only been Immaculate Conception and the Assumption of Mary, the only
Right.
two
Yeah.
times. He doesn't have that stance, so we can't really fall on that type of on the scale. So and honestly, personally, for me, I'm still trying to figure out what all this means, and because when you look at the modern day, you start to ask more questions about what did Vatican I teach on this stuff. Pope Francis is definitely leading us to have those conversations today, and having
Mhm,
those debates, which what I've concluded is that the church hasn't clarified these things. They've said what Vatican I is talking about is papal infallibility and all that, but they haven't really clarified extensively what these things mean and what happens when you have a pope who's teaching heresy. What do we do with that? I don't know if there's an official teaching from the church on that. At least I know for sure that there isn't, as far as what the councils have taught. Um, but we do know that Honorius was condemned for heresy.
mhm.
So there's that. So it's possible for a pope to fall into a heresy. Um, but there's a lot of questions from Vatican I, at least personally for me. I don't pretend to know all the answers. We just present what we know, and hopefully one day the church clarifies these things. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Oh no, you're fine. And I actually wanted to ask, because I remember reading that passage and being really struck by it. What page was that again? Do you recall when he talks about the sea of pestilence?
So I have the play books, like kind of like the Kindle version of the book,
Oh, gotcha.
and I don't know how I can. Let me see if I can try page 23. It says page 23 on it, but I don't know if that's like page 23 for you as well. I'm not really
Yeah, if it
sure.
like corresponds. Let's see.
And because I can zoom in and out of the words, and as if I zoom in, the page number changes.
Oh,
Um,
oh, gotcha. Yeah.
So I don't think it actually, no, it did not change. Yeah, no, it did not change actually. So it could be page 23. But anyway, is there anything on that from that you wanted me to read, like in context? I can even pull it up if you want.
Yeah, I
And
like to
say,
like read from that whole quote because that's something that I think should be. Yeah,
sure.
read.
So the paragraph starts like this. He says, this prerogative granted to St. Peter by the Lord Jesus Christ was supposed to pass to all Peter's successors, because the chair of Peter is a center of unity in the church. But if the pontiff should fall into an error of faith, the church would dissolve, deprived of the bond of unity. And then he goes on to quote that quote that I just read here. Um, and then the next paragraph, he says, let no one say, yes, the see of Peter is the center of unity, but from that there only follows the office which the Roman pastor has of confirming and of preserving his brothers in the faith. But the office is one thing, the authority, especially an infallible authority, is something else. I reply, how would the Roman pontiff be able to fulfill this office, which was divinely and especially given to him, if he did not have a special authority which all others, even the bishops, whether dispersed throughout the world or gathered together should recognize as unsaleable. So basically saying like, you can't believe that the Pope has equal power to all the bishops. So he has real authority in
Mhm.
order to exercise this infallibility and this supremacy in the church. He has real authority. Um, I think this is one of the most important quotes from the Relatio, and I wish more theologians would talk about this, especially today.
Mhm.
What does this mean in a historical context, and what does this mean for us today? Just because of like I said, Pope Francis is leading us to ask these types of questions, because from Pope Benedict to Pope John Paul II, we didn't really have a pope that was um and I don't want to say something that is erroneous, and I want to respect the office of the papacy,
Mhm.
but it just seems like he wants to get rid of things that are ancient, I guess, or traditional, and he wants to change the church and make it more modern, right? And personally for me, I'm very uncomfortable with that idea. um so this is why I think we need to have these discussions, like, and I just listened to a debate between um Timothy Gordon and Timothy Flanders. I think it was
Mhm.
yesterday, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
um
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and that was a good debate to have, right? That's an important question to ask. Can the Pope change? Can the Pope get rid of the 1962 missile altogether? Yes or no? And I don't have an opinion on that. I'm not an expert on this. I don't know the answer to that question. To be frank, but I really enjoy listening to both sides, and I think both sides make good points. Um, but I do tend to lean towards the answer of yes, he can, but I'm not confident in that answer. I should put it that way. But if somebody were to put a gun in my head and be like, "Here, what's your guess? What's the truth?" That's the one I'd probably
Yeah.
guess. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're definitely fine. Yeah, and that's my working understanding with that is at least how I understand. I forget if it was Pius XI or Pius XII's Mediator Dei um, on the liturgy. It seems like I also kind of lean more to the view that yes, he can abolish rights and so forth. I know that Traditionis Custodes was more about being a motu proprio of restriction than abolition. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think some news outlets kind of spin it in that way. And again, I'm not saying um, I had mixed feelings about the motu proprio myself, but I understood why Pope Francis did that. And I think one thing it makes me think of too in reading Gasser and the Sea of Pestilence quote that you cited and that others have cited too is with Archbishop Vigano, because he's literally said that there's a there's a counter church and there's the modernist church, and Rome is essentially fallen, and it's not a terrible leap in logic to connect the dots to basically say that his view is that Pope Francis is an anti-pope or is so antagonistic against the church. It's a weird ecclesiology that tends itself towards sedevacantism, or lends itself to that, I should say. And but I do agree with you that we definitely, a lot of theologians need to be having more like definitive conversations in what all this fleshed out means in various contexts and so forth. Because you're right, like from my own reading of church history, it really just seems that there is a stream of tradition in the Western canonical literature about the popes where it gets collected famously in St. Robert Bellarmine on the Roman Pontiff, where he goes through the various views about papal deposition and extraordinary um, councils that could, depose a pope on certain views, and it's nuanced because technically it's not that the council is deposing a pope, it's that if he is a manifest heretic, he's no longer a pope, so now you're deposing a layperson, basically. And so it's along those lines. And yeah, the church has never defined this, and this has been going on, these type of debates. I mean, I just read Francis Dvornik's book on the Phocian Schism, and even since the 9th century and onwards in the Western tradition, this was never really, it didn't come up as much until, like, when you have instances with, was it the anti-pope John the 23rd or 22nd? And so forth, and the controversy there with the Franciscan doctrine on poverty and stuff. And Bellarmine goes through that and so forth and gives his view, and he gives the view of Cardinal Cajetan and others and so forth. And but yeah, you're right. It's that's one thing that is a little bit kind of frustrating, is that there is no sort of definitive thing. But all I can sort of get at with reading what I've read is that the Holy Spirit guides and assists the Pope, and that he won't ultimately lead the church into error and so forth. And that's not just a blind faith type thing either. It is recognizing it does have faith involved, yes. But it is, and it can be hard at times, especially in a lot of modern times in the current day. I do have, like, just to put cards on the table, I do have a more positive view of, like, Pope Francis, but I'm not like a fangirl either. Like, I recognize there's some things I still disagree with in terms of prudential judgments and so forth. But I don't think he's a heretic or anything like that. And I think that Gasser's book is really important today, especially for those who want to say that the Pope is in schism, like a lot of ratrads that are saying that the Pope is in schism from the church, which I'm like, if you really consistently believe that, you should be Orthodox, because that's not a Catholic notion of ecclesiology historically. It's just not. Like,
right. I think the only possibility for what they're saying to be true is if he's an anti-pope.
right?
If
Yeah.
he's a true pope, that's just according to our teaching that would be impossible. If the true pope is leading the faithful to commit grave sin or to apostasy, that's a no-no. That falsifies the church, right? That falsifies the church altogether. So he has to be an anti-pope for that to happen. I don't believe he's an anti-pope. I will never believe a pope is an anti-pope by my own authority. It would have to be something where the church has to speak on that matter. And it is possible one day the church can say Pope Francis is an anti-pope, just like it's possible,
right.
That's happened so many times, right? And I'm not saying specifically about Pope Francis, there's anything about him that would make him that. I'm just saying that it's possible that he could be one, right?
Right, definitely.
It's possible.
Yeah.
So that's the only time that would be possible for them to say things like that, or for that to be true, for him to lead people to apostasy if he is an anti-pope. If he's a true pope, I don't see how you can take the position of the Catholic Church saying that he's a true pope, and at the same time say he's leading people to apostasy. That would falsify Vatican I, which would falsify the papacy, which would falsify the Catholic Church altogether.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yep. So, and that is a good point. Yeah, there's paradoxes in church history. I know the Honorius example is brought up. What's interesting about that is that it's by papal authority that a pope is declared to be deposed. Saint Leo II talks very highly about his Petrine prerogatives, and then he talks about how Pope Honorius permitted these errors to be to stain the reputation of the apostolic see and all that, and so forth. And so, even within our own tradition, it's like, okay, you have a pope that's deposed for the canonical crime of heresy, but it's not, because prima facie, when I first learned about that, it was more, and I almost had the impression was given to me, and usually it often is, especially if someone's a conciliarist, that it's this council that's doing that and issuing of sort of a veto against the Pope and condemning him. But when you go into the history, it's Saint Pope Leo II, and you're just like, well, wait a second, how does that? And that leads to other questions, too, and so forth. And I know there's the issue of because there's the issue of Saint Maximus the Confessor saying he was Orthodox, and then John the Fourth saying that he was Orthodox and so forth, or didn't mean the words in his letter in a monophysite way and so forth. So you have all that work functioning, and then you even have, like, it's funny because Klaus Schatz, the Jesuit German who wrote the book Papal Primacy, Origins to the Present, and when he talks about Honorius, he's very defensive of him, like in a not in like a knee-jerk reaction, but he's basically like, oh yeah, he this thing has been pretty much settled, and he because at the first part of the book is kind of somewhat not necessarily critical of Catholic perspective, because he doesn't think for Schatz, his view isn't undermining the Catholic view, even though others have argued that it kind of does in what he says, and so forth. And he makes some distinctions too, like between I know other Orthodox do this, like between auctoritas and potestas, of power and authority and so forth. And he kind of says that that's what Leo had in the first millennium. But then in the second part of the book, when he goes through the second millennium, he basically is like, all hands on deck defending papal infallibility from the 1300s onwards. But in the first millennium, when he goes over Honorius, he basically makes that distinction. So it can't be a simplistic answer of like, well, he wasn't a heretic in any sense at all. But in what sense was he? And another, trying to find it here actually. I have not yet read this, but a Facebook friend recommended me this book, but Pope Honorius Before the Tribunal of Reason and History, and by an older Catholic patristic scholar. I think it's from the 19th century or 20th, I forget. But apparently it's still kind of, from what I've been told, it's still good, basically. But all that's to say, it's always, I know some people might be kind of either not necessarily bored, but I know it's often used, but the Catholic phrase both and, it's really is a lot of both and full picture type of thing, and recognizing what was going on. A similar thing too is, I'll just say this in passing because this could be its whole episode, is Dvorak in his book The Votion Schism talks about how there was high views in the East during this time and prior at Second Nicaea as well, of pentarchy, of the 5 patriarchates being this divinely ordered and established thing. And so that's why I think people like Michael Lofton and others say that you can find Orthodox ecclesiologies in the first millennium. And also I would say that pentarchy doesn't necessarily depending how it would depend how you interpret it, of course, but it doesn't necessarily undermine the Catholic view and so forth. But sorry, I know that was a lot, but yeah, that was just my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think the pentarchy, the importance of the pentarchy in the first millennium is that it shows universality, right? Mm-hmm. You're saying, okay, Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and all the sees, and they agree on something, just like we believe today, the sensus fidelium. Imagine if all the bishops, the whole church believed this. We don't have the pentarchy today as it was in the first millennium in the Catholic Church, mm-hmm. but we still have this idea of when the bishops all agree universally, then that is an infallible teaching. So I think the pentarchy is important, not because it's the opinion of Alexandria matters and the opinion of Antioch. It's important because it's showing the universality of truth, right? The truth is universal. And when there is universal truth, then that's a dogma. So today, when the Catholic Church gets together in an ecumenical council, it's not like the Pope comes and says, here's how it's gonna work, guys, and everyone's gonna listen to me right now. Here's the teaching, and everyone is just going to accept it. Now, that definitely has happened before with Pope Leo and his tome. He just hammers it down. You accept it, you're Catholic. If you don't, you're schismatic, and you need to leave the church. Basically, was a stance. But it typically doesn't work that way. In an ecumenical
Right.
council, it's bishops getting together and discussing matters and agreeing on dogma, and the Pope consenting to it. That's the way it's supposed to work. And I just wanted to take this time to clarify something, because a lot of folks think that I've been saying that the Pope can't act alone, right? Can the Pope act alone? And people, I've literally said, like, so many times on the shows that I've done, that yes, the Pope can, C-A-N, act alone, right? He can't on a juridical level. Like, he has that power to do that, right?
Right.
But if you've been watching my shows, my series on the Relatio, what I've been trying to say is it's not supposed to work that way. That's not how Vatican I saw it working. That's not how Gasser saw it working. It's supposed to be the Pope is supposed to act with his brother bishops. That's how it's supposed to work. And providentially, that's how it will always work. Providentially, right?
Yeah.
Juridically, he has that power to act alone. So, and even with the recent what is it called, on the Latin Mass, Pope Francis
Motu proprio.
motu proprio, even the recent one, folks are like, oh, there you go, he did this all on his own, he acted alone. Well, if you read the motu proprio itself, he says that he consulted the bishops, right? He consulted the bishop. We don't know to what extent he did. We don't have the results. We don't have the polls or how he did, but you can see how he's mentioning that for a reason, because that's how it's supposed to work. The Pope is supposed to consult the bishops, talk to the bishops before he acts, right? So just to clarify to everyone, yes, the Pope can't act alone, but that's not how it's supposed to work. And if he does act alone, if there's a case where he neglects the whole church, he separates himself from the church, and he acts alone, he is committing a grave sin by doing that. That's how serious it is, even though juridically he has that power, because the Vatican I did not take away, did not say you have to poll the bishops. It says, that's just the way it's supposed to work, relatively speaking, but it's not an absolute way of the way it's supposed to work. And if you don't think that, if you think I'm changing my stance, go back and watch my shows. I've said it multiple times. I can even give people timestamps what I said. Yes, the Pope can't act alone, and then I go clarify that and qualify that. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's a great clarification and a great point. I actually was was trying to remember to bring the issue up of the interplay between the Pope and the bishops, because so often Vatican I is viewed as this very sort of dry, autocratic, top down, I say so, it goes type of thing, where it really is, as O'Connor in his commentary and Gasser in the Relatio itself talk about that. It's the Pope and the bishops in communion with the Bishop of Rome. And also that's, leads the way. O'Connor talks about towards the end how that this is the setup to Lumen Gentium in Vatican II, dogmatic constitution on the church, and how that is the final say, or the ending, the completion of Vatican I, since Vatican I, as you know, was interrupted by the Franco-Prussian War, and so they had to kind of go because bombs were going off, but or were going to go off, and so and that similar things too that Benedict has said, even though he didn't say this in magisterial works, he still said that the Pope is not like a dictator or tyrant, and so forth, so on and so forth. And, there's the famous line from Saint Pope Gregory the Great, that, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is to be the servant of the servants of God. And so putting in that very humble servant leading type of attitude and way. And I mean, that's a man that, ate with a lot of homeless people and poor people, had them over to his house for dinner and so forth. It's one of the things about Pope Gregory the Great that I love. So what a humble and holy man he was. And so, yeah, it's really important because people, for the life of me, I don't understand why, but in different rad trad, circles. And again, people are saying like, what if you're asking why are you going after rad trads? I used to be one, so I had this phase with Taylor Marshall that I burnt me out and almost led me to like sedevacantism, which if it wasn't for people like William Albrecht helped me through that over like a Facebook chat and talking on the phone about it. And then just reading more about the papacy and talking to Eric. But anyway, that aside, so I'm critical because I'm kind of seeing my past self in this too. And but one thing I noticed that just became kind of irrational to me is that a lot of these rad trads are very antagonistic to like the concept of like collegiality. And I'm just like, well, why? There should be collegiality of consulting bishops, not just and it's not denying, because sometimes it's perceived as a denial of like St. Robert Bellarmine's ecclesiology, where he talks about the papacy as the divine monarchy established by Christ, and that Christ is the king. Since Christ is the king, Peter is his vicar or his on earth. He's the one standing in for the king. And I know this is something that, Swan Sona has talked a lot about on your show and other shows as well. And so, shout out to him. I actually, quick rabbit trail. I actually was able to meet him a couple weeks ago. And so we were able to hang out. That was great.
Yeah, that's awesome. I saw some pictures or a picture. That was really cool. That's really cool when people online and you're like, okay, now I can actually meet them and talk to them and see what they're like in person.
Yeah, it's like you are real.
Yeah, you are real. Yeah, that quote you mentioned by Pope St. Gregory the Great, it's quoted in Vatican I. Ironically, right? They actually quote that, and that was like I believe that they inserted that into Vatican I after much discussion to clarify. Look, we're not saying that the Pope has absolute monarch power, right? His power is, the purpose of it is for service, right? Mm-hmm. So his purpose isn't to, it would be against his office if he were to go to the bishop of, let's say, Detroit, right? He'll be like, okay, look, listen, from now on, you're only going to wear red shoes only, and you're only going to use red candles. That would be an abuse of power, even though juridically, like I said, he has that authority to do that. But it would be an abuse of his power, and it would probably be a sinful thing for him to do if he just does it just because he wants to show his power, right? There's no purpose to it. So the whole purpose of his power, and he has to have real power, just like we read from Gasser, or else it'll just be an equal bishop with everyone. It's to keep watch, to make sure everyone's playing nice, but you have to have real power. Imagine me, I have 2 kids. Imagine me as a parent. I don't have power over my kids. I can't tell my kid to do right or wrong. If I'm equal to them, then I would have no power. Then she can do whatever she wants, my 2-year-old, and I won't have any say. That doesn't work that way. And I don't want to make it seem like the papacy is a father-son relationship, even though early church, they did address, at the Council of Chalcedon, they did address him as father, and they did address themselves as his children. But it's probably more like, big brother and little brother, where the big brother has authority over the little brothers. It's probably closer to that, but not exactly that. And then to your, you mentioned something else I wanted to comment on about, I can't remember, about rad trads and
collegiality and how
collegiality. Yeah, what's funny is a lot of folks don't know this, but the SSPX, they schismed, or I don't know if you want to call it schism. Some people say yes, or some people say no, but whatever you want to call it, right? They're no longer, and under the normal circumstances that a regular bishop is today. One of the main issues for them wasn't just the liturgy. One of the main issues for them was collegiality.
Yeah.
Which for me, for the life of me, I can't figure out. I mean, you look at the early church, the first millennium, the popes were operating in collegiality
Right.
almost every time, if not every time, right? That's how it's supposed to work. Like I said, that's how it's supposed to work. And if you think that after first millennium that changed, the Catholic Church has had so many ecumenical councils, right? After the first millennium,
Mm-hmm.
if actually they have had more ecumenical councils in the second millennium than they've had in the first millennium. So if the ideology of the papacy or the ideology of the Catholic Church changed to, okay, now the Pope is a monarch, well, they sure didn't practice that very well, because they could have just asked the Pope, hey, can you tell us what to believe about this issue? No, they didn't do that. They actually held councils,
Mm-hmm.
which the popes were the ones who opened those councils, because that's, again, how it's supposed to work, right? But yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to comment on those two things.
Yeah, those are great points. It makes me think too of, because a lot of them don't really like, whether SSPX or other types of rat trads or not. A lot of them don't like Yves Congar. And I read his book after 900 years on the schism between the East and West, and he goes through roughly the first 900 years. And what's interesting is that. When I first, because I read, when I was looking into Catholicism, I read Timothy Ware's The Orthodox Church. And in that book, he was talking very highly of the Catholic theologian Congar. And I was like, well, who's this Congar guy? He sounds very almost conciliaristic or whatever, or collegial. And it's interesting because if you read after 900 years, yes, he will make concessions to the East that would make some or many rat trads uncomfortable, but it's in no way to undermine the authority of the papacy or the divinity of the office. At the same time, the punching line is he in his work, he goes through all these concessions and how like Rome could do better to approach the East and so forth. Then he has this kicker. He basically says, I can't be Orthodox, and I'm not Orthodox because Rome has divine primacy from Christ. And he basically says, everything that I find in Gregory the Great and Leo the Great, in Pelagius the First and Second, in Boniface the First, in Gelasius, and all these popes, they basically say what the Catholic Church is saying today. And he basically says, and for that reason, the Orthodox are schismatic. And it's kind of just like mic drop, and that's it. And it's so even someone that's highly praised by Eastern theologians and bishops like Callistus Ware and so forth, even Congar himself, I mean, he's still, because it's like he's still Catholic. He's not a modernist. And that's the thing. The expectation is to read him because he was also part of the Neo Theology, the New Theology. And so people have a perception of that all the people in that group are modernists. So by guilt by association, essentially. And so, but I think that's really, if you read, I recommend everyone read after 900 years, and it's a very different picture.
Absolutely. Kyle Marks has a question here.
Oh, sure.
So if you want to feel free to take this one. He says, do you believe Hoc, I think he meant Sancta.
Hoc Sancta, yeah.
Sancta, yeah. Taught heresy. How do you interpret it in light of Vatican I?
That's a good question. That's something I'm honestly still working through and haven't done as much reading as I would like to. I've read, it's been mentioned in a lot of secondary literature in passing, and I know I've read more about critical views of it, like Papadakis in his book does mention Hoc Sancta, and there's some Orthodox articles I read on it that basically will use it as sort of papal double talk, basically, where it took their thesis essentially is it took conciliarism at the Council of Constance to sort of do the failures, to fix the failures of the high papal theology that had emerged from the Avignon papacy and so forth, and that couldn't resolve it. My leaning is, having said that, I still have a lot more to research on this. My leaning is that I think it could be interpreted, and I've seen certain academic articles out there where people try to take a collegial approach to it, and I've seen some Eastern Catholics take a look at it as well, kind of put it in that type of conciliar way and collegial way, but not conciliaristic, where it's over the Pope. But it definitely is an area with a lot of nuance, and it's not clean. It's one of those areas in church history where it's pretty thorny, and it's a lot of back and forth, and especially with the context of the Avignon Papacy as well, and like them deciding, well, which popes were the rightful successor, and then again the aftermath of Constance and all that, and then later Western canon law. And Bellarmine only mentions it in passing too, so I hope that kind of answers. It's pretty much I don't see it as inherently problematic, but it's not an easy thing. I wouldn't, we shouldn't be presumptuous about saying, oh yeah, Hoc Sancta is such an easy thing. And I would also try to find, I can't remember off the top of my head. I know I've watched all of his shows that he's done on the papacy, and I've watched all of your shows too on Gasser. But I think Michael Lofton either did a show on it about Hoc Sancta or wrote an article. I can't remember. So either reach out to him or Eric Ibarra, because they're better at that than I am. So yeah, but bottom line is it's not insurmountable, I would say. It requires some nuance and thinking through.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a good answer. And I'm with you. It's not something that I've studied to where I can answer the question. So, Eric Ibarra, Michael Lofton would probably be better ones to ask about that question. But I do I do emphasize collegiality, that, that's so, but there's still some issues with Hoc Sancta, even regardless if you emphasize collegiality or not.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it seems like they're saying that the council can judge a pope. Now, it was a very muddy situation, right? It was one of those extraordinary situations in the church. So sometimes you do need some extraordinary responses to those situations, to where this is not the norm, but here we are, we have to do this kind of thing. But it's a very important question, and I think that question, and also the question of Pope Vigilius, those are the two, like you said,
right.
thorny questions in the Catholic Church. And look, I'm always honest. Like, sometimes we don't have all the answers. There's more questions than answers, right? But I always look at, okay, we can't answer if we can't answer those questions as Catholics. What is the alternative, right? The alternative would be Eastern Orthodoxy. The alternative is Protestantism or Oriental Orthodoxy. And there's even more questions, in my opinion, from what I've seen in those churches that are unanswerable, a lot more. And I think deathly, like it's a blow to their position, in my opinion, obviously, as a Catholic. Which is going to lead me to my last question here, and we can. It's been over almost an hour and a half, so we can end the show here. What would you say? Like, what is, if someone were to come up to you and say, "Why should I become Catholic?" in the context of the papacy, what would be your answer if you was a Eastern Orthodox or a Protestant or an Oriental Orthodox?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that, when I've had my own doubts and stuff, I've had to ask myself. I've said to some friends of mine that I'm barely not Catholic, or I'm barely not Orthodox in some ways. And what I mean by that is this: if there is no divine promise from Christ to Peter, and how that's been not just the biblical data, but also how that's unfolded in the first millennium and the second millennium, how it's been interpreted. Often it's been called the ecclesiastical hermeneutic of Matthew 16. I think that there's a lot of strong evidence and argument for that interpretation, and that we see this divine authority carried out consistently from popes very early on. Even though it's not always the same level of development, we can see high levels of authority of the office as early as Saint Pope Victor I in Saint Stephen in Damasus I, Saint Pope Damasus I, who he says is explicit that these prerogatives of primacy is by divine right. It's not by the establishment of conciliar decrees or ecumenical councils or synods. And then later on, as that unfolds even more, you have this just consistent approach and organic development that happens that I see that I think is really just naturally leads to Vatican I. And so I'm not really, because like Papadakis will talk about how the Gregorian reforms were where the East and West break off. But the problem is that a lot of the theology of the Gregorian reforms in terms of divine primacy, not talking about forgeries of decretals or false literatures that did creep into canons and so forth, but specifically theological claims from Pope Nicholas I. And if you don't like Pope Nicholas, then his successors, his predecessors, as well. I mean, as late as Gregory the Great to Boniface I to Gelasius to Hadrian I at Second Nicaea. It's really hard. The more I delve into church history, it's really hard for me to see that at the very least, this is the view they held of themselves. And I don't think this is a heresy that's persisting. Not that I think the papal view is a heresy, but if I was to hold the Orthodox position, it would have to be heresy. But because it would be a rather strange heresy that persisted for such a long time. And it would lead one to question, why did God allow that for so long if it's wrong? And it's like, yes, saints in your tradition, both recognize saints. Both Catholics and Orthodox recognize that saints can be wrong and so forth, but it starts to push the limits of logic, and where you're wondering, is this not cognitive dissonance to see these many bishops of Rome? And so what I usually have respect for, at least, even though I disagree with Orthodox, is that at least those Orthodox that take these bishops of Rome and give a different alternative interpretation. I think that's what you really would have to do, but I think it's kind of hard given the way they speak about their office, especially Pope Agatho and Pope Hormisdas, talking about the soteriological necessity of being in communion with Rome and equating communion with Rome as the Catholic Church. That's pretty significant. And so, to use Luther's phrase, here I stand, I can do no other.
So. Yeah, no, that would probably be my answer as well, is the divine institution, and the popes believe that very early on. That had to come from something, right? It had to come, if it's that early, the question is, where did it come from? Did the popes just make it up and pass it on to the next pope? And, there's this position of, in the early church, there were two ecclesiologies. There's the ecclesiology of the East, and there's ecclesiology of the West. And and there is a little bit of truth to that, but I don't think that that's absolutely true. And then there's also this idea of the East only used the West's authority when it suited them, right? They just kind of used it for political reasons. Now, that's disingenuous to the Eastern saints, because if you're going to say that, then you're going to say, okay, then these men are using heresy in the West to to get what their agenda is. Come on now. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Not that there weren't any political things in the background of a lot of these debates, just like like the Chalcedon was very political, as we all know. Even Ephesus was very political. But I don't think these men are sitting there using a heresy of what the popes teach, their authority, for their own benefit. If it's a heresy and you're a saint, you're going to be against that, just because you have that gift of faith, and you're going to stand against heresy, right? That's why they're saints. That's why they're we look up to them. They're our church fathers. So the divine institution of the papacy, to me, is a huge blow to the Eastern Orthodox. That's one of the blows that I had in mind, um, just because it's so early on, it's so consistent, and it gets more and more explicit as we go, every century from the first millennium and on.
Mhm.
Um, so then it's like, what do you do with those? And I've seen some Eastern Orthodox apologists try to, like, oh, yeah, but the East didn't accept that
Yeah. Byzantine
interpretation.
flattery.
Byzantine flattery.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that's just not going to fly for me, at least personally. That's just not going to convince me, to be Eastern Orthodox. Just Byzantine flattery, um, because your own saints are saying the things that you're saying are heresy. That's a problem.
Yeah.
Um, so, in any sense, I really did appreciate you coming on, and I really enjoyed having you on. I know we said we're gonna keep it at an hour or
Yeah.
less, but that never works. Never
Yeah.
works. Which I don't mind. It's always fun to do these shows. But any final words or any final thoughts before we shut off the internet here?
Yeah, just a few quick things. One is like, the testimony of many Eastern saints is also helpful, like Theodore the Studite, who, I mean, even Father Laurent Kleinwork in his book, His Broken Body, he literally says that, uh, you know, Saint Theodore the Studite says it as Catholic as you can get, Roman Catholic as you can get, on the Roman primacy being divinely established and so forth. And then even Photius, Photius of Constantinople, who is a saint in the Orthodox Church and the Eastern Catholic churches as well, is venerated by them. He, even with his fallouts with Pope Saint Nicholas I, even he says that the primacy is of divine institution, and he dies in peace with the Bishop of Rome in full communion. It's restored by Saint John VIII and the efforts of Hadrian and so forth, Hadrian II. And so, that's pretty significant. And so there's a lot more that could be said. And the transition of Byzantine thought in the 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th century, as Sachensky talks about, I think that period is where we kind of see the Eastern shift of emphasis in from a Catholic perspective, reinterpreting some of the papal divine statements of primacy into an Orthodox conciliar way, since Agatho and Hermistus are on their diptychs, and are saints venerated by them. So then the other thing I would say too is right now I'm actually I've been working on a video review of Francis Dvornik's book, The Phocian Schism. I'm at right now. I have like 31 videos, 31 minutes made for it so far. So stay tuned for that. I basically review it and I go over a lot of highlights. I don't know how long it will be, and there's this software that I'm buying to edit as well, because I'm doing it. It's just me and Zoom with the icon of St. Photius, and I'm going through really important passages that I've highlighted in Dvornik's book on papal primacy and the Filioque as well. So to give kind of a 30,000 foot view of that. So stay tuned for that, because I'm trying to start up more with my own podcast and stuff. And I'm very thankful for you having me on too. This is really great. And my video list on the papacy that I've watched, you can find if you're part of the Facebook group of Papal Primacy, Eric Ybarra's group. That's there. I'm also going to be creating a blog, and I'm trying to make a master list and various lists under different categories and subcategories of videos that I've watched, and eventually try to go more into review and also do interviews with people. Like, I'd like to have Eric on to talk about some things as well. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome, and I'm sure he'd love to be on. Not to speak for him, but he's always willing to come on and do shows. But I appreciate you coming on. And I look forward to that. Please let me know when you post that. I'd love to check it out, and maybe you can come back on the show, and we can show it live and talk about it. And you can go through it as we're watching it, kind of like a live commentary. I think that
Oh,
would be
sure.
very
Yeah.
fun. But in any sense, again, I appreciate you being on, and I want everyone to if you can, please like. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. And other than that, that is all for tonight. So everyone have a great night, and you as well, James.
Thanks a lot, Elijah. God bless. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. God bless.